All right. Thank you, Rachel. And contrary to what Rachel said, I'm actually not planning on doing most of the talking tonight. I want to let our three fantastic guests tell their stories. As much as I can, I'm going to sort of stay out of the way and let them do the talking. We have tonight three very talented composers, two of whom are longtime dear friends of mine, and one of whom I had the pleasure of meeting last year at the Canton Symphony, but will have the pleasure of getting to know a lot better when the Canton Symphony premieres a new work of his next year. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about your background, your personal background, musical background, and specifically how you came to decide that you wanted to devote your life to being a composer of Western art music. We will take this first question in alphabetical order, and we will start with Zach Gulabov Davis.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Matthew, for having me. It's a real pleasure. This is my second time in one of these Canton Symphony talks, and it's a real honor, so thank you. Yeah, so I'm Zach Gulabov Davis. I've been composing, I guess at this point, about 7 years. I almost came upon composition by accident. I played music my entire life. I started as a pianist when I was about probably 4 or 5, then percussion, orchestral percussion specifically in a youth orchestra, very similar to the Canton Youth Symphony in my early teens, and then went to college to study music and math. About halfway through my undergraduate education, I happened upon a class called Music Theory of the 20th Century. If you have any familiarity with music theory, some of these sort of rudimentary classes in this discipline can be really cut and dry. There's some very sort of specific rules that one has to follow, lots of parameters sort of set up, and sometimes it can feel a little dull. I teach a lot of music theory, so I don't want to bash it too much, but as an undergrad, I felt that was slightly dull. So by the time I ended up in music theory of the 20th century, my eyes just sort of opened to all the possibilities one could do. So instead of having really specific parameters, there was sort of a myriad of options one could take. You could write very, say, esoteric, dissonant music that appeals to like a subset of a subset of a subset of a, musical population. You could write, say, music that's more in the line of musical theater, or you could do something that maybe appeals to, say, your general classical concert-going audience. And there's just so many possibilities for harmonic color, for melodic nuance, for all kinds of different things. And I really loved it. And at the time in this class, we had to write short pieces, just like literally 8 measures or something, 8 to 16 measures, pieces that are like 15, 20 seconds long, using different techniques. And that just really spoke to me. I had all these little pieces just sitting on my desk one day, and I was like, maybe I should see if I can do this, in some more sort of expanded capacity other than just in this class. So I remember talking to my advisor, this was my junior year, saying that I wanted to go to grad school for music composition. And she was like, oh, okay, have you composed anything? I'm like, nah, not really, just the stuff in that class. And so I sort of just got to work at that point. I think having the exposure to so much classical music, both as a pianist and most especially in the youth orchestra setting, just sort of opened my eyes. There's no better compositional teacher than just listening to music and learning. So having that exposure before that sort of served as a kind of formative learning experience, a kind of springboard into the world of composition. So I just started writing, and sure, a lot of pieces were missteps. There were a lot of, faltering things here and there, but I started to put together a portfolio. I just loved writing music. I loved writing stuff that connected with the audience and connected with the performers, and ended up going to grad school at Mannes College of Music, where I met my good friend, Matthew. He was the first person I met of anyone there. We've stayed in touch since then. And yeah, I went to the Peabody Institute after that for my doctorate, also studying composition, of course, and I haven't looked back. I currently live in Jersey City, New Jersey, and I've basically been using this pandemic to compose a lot. It's almost like a, well, I don't want to say mini because it's been going on so long, but it's a extensive artist residency where I can work. So I look forward to hearing your questions, comments, and feedback pretty soon, but thank you again.
Thank you so much, Zach. Next, we will turn to Daniel Pertu.
Hi, everyone. So a lot of us have somewhat similar stories, although I think mine sort of starts with just a love of what we call classical art music. The labels are all tricky, but from when I was really, really young, and just always after writing music or after learning a fair amount of music, then wanted to always create my own. There was always a creative impulse there. I got a little sick of practicing Mozart sonatas on the piano, for example. I started piano when I was 5, and as much as I loved playing, and I loved playing, I played the bassoon also, and play in ensembles, etc. I think the creative aspect of actually making it up was the most interesting to me. As far as, then you go through college and stuff. I didn't necessarily go to college with the intent of being a composer, but I did want to be a musician to a certain extent. And then I really found that I wanted to be a composer more in the graduate school time, sort of similar to the other story we heard. And then there was no looking back after that. So now I'm a composition professor also, and trying to balance composing with teaching. Also do a fair amount of that. Most musicians teach to a certain extent. And as far as what draws me to the craft and the style and everything like that, I'm most inspired by music that has some kind of emotional and narrative impulse to it, and particularly interested in either fantastical or sort of extra-worldly kinds of things. So when I write, like the piece that I'm writing for Canton, it's on a planetary theme, but also I've written things on, I have a viola concerto on the mythical character of Merlin. I have some other recent pieces that involve myths and legends, and so like a piano concerto also on entitled Elven Dream. I'm very much inspired by fantasy, and so that's how I come to it. I like music is, for me, a way to escape reality, and I like to create things that take audiences beyond sort of the real world and inspire them in their imaginations.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel. And finally, Michael Spiroff.
Hey, thanks so much. So I kind of discovered this career possibility late in the early stage, and that'll kind of make sense as I describe it. So I started off really loving music, studying jazz on the saxophone. When I was about 10 years old, I played for about 6 years, and I absolutely loved it. I studied with Tara Davidson here in Toronto, and we kind of went really intense into the jazz theory world, into that kind of niche of the music world. And then sort of towards the end of that, I realized that even though I had the love for jazz, I wanted to venture into the classical world. And I started studying, classical voice after that during my high school years. And right before applying to undergrads, I realized that I wanted to study composition. And kind of off the cuff, I applied to Manus, where I met Matthew and Zach. I got into their undergrad there in composition. And having kind of both a jazz and also a musical theater background, I late in that stage realized, I think even loving and having this background, I wanted to kind of veer to a different direction into the classical world. So I got into Manus and I spent 4 years there. And during those years, I had that kind of intense, the way an undergrad composition degree works is, I think, much more specialized than a lot of other degrees. And being there really confirmed confirmed that I had chosen the right direction. And since then, I've been doing my master's at McGill University in Montreal, where I'll be finishing in December. And part of the draw there was as part of the grad program, you ideally get a residency with one of the major ensembles there. And I got a residency with their chamber choir, and I wrote them a piece, and they toured it a bunch of times. And that experience really kind of confirmed what I had suspected for a long time that I wanted, but it really confirmed that this is the right career for me. And that's where I am now. So I'll be finishing in December there. But yeah, that's where my route is taking me.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for your answers to the first question. Now, something that hopefully everybody here is most curious to hear from all of you. You sit down at a table, you have a blank sheet of staff paper in front of you and a pencil, or possibly you sit down at your computer and a blank sheet of staff paper is on the screen. How do you go from that to a finished piece that an audience hears in a concert hall? And we're going to go in reverse order this time. We will start with Michael, and I know that he is planning to talk specifically about how he wrote the piece for the McGill Chamber Choir, but address your general compositional process, how you go from the blank page to the performance. Michael, you have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Would you like me to address the specific piece as well in this section?
Both the general process as well as the specific piece.
Good. So I would say that I actually don't start on the staff paper. That's kind of maybe step 2 or 3 for me. So I mean, as composers, we usually are given the 2 parameters of the instrumentation and an approximate length are kind of the 2 things that were given before beginning a piece, which obviously there's endless possibilities, but that also at least narrows it down to something. So what I usually start with is some sort of abstract graphic representation, not a graphic score, but a graphic representation of what I envision for the piece. So I'll start with either a blank piece of paper where I kind of draw anywhere from the kind of literal to the metaphoric version of what I kind of envision for the piece. And once I have a very, very vague idea of, all right, this is where I'm going to go from beginning to end, then I'll go to the staff paper. And in terms of this choir piece, I knew that I had just a few minutes. I think they gave me a maximum of 5 minutes, which is not very long. And I knew I had a chamber choir. So mixed soprano, alto, tenor, bass choir. I knew I had all these voices and not too much time. So I spoke with the conductor who would be conducting this piece, and it was going to be programmed on a concert of various kind of memorial type pieces, all either choir or piano plus choir. So what I decided on was the text from the end of the Eastern Orthodox Church's funeral service text, which is a short text. I can share my screen here right now, so we can get a little bit of context. Here we go. One moment. There we go. Okay, so the text here, I said it in the original Old Church Slavonic, but I've got the English translation. So quite a short text. And for the context of this piece, I thought what I'm working with here is a spectrum from all of the kind of rigid traditions that you expect in a choral piece like this, all the way to completely going against tradition. And I think as composers with a context like this, we try to find a good sweet spot in between those two, because we don't want to mimic the traditional, but we also don't want to completely go so far from it that it's barely recognizable. So I listened to a lot of traditional music of this choir genre, and what I decided going with was, well, there are certain elements that we can go with. We have the basic elements of music. We have melody, harmony, rhythm, texture, timbre. And one thing that stuck with me with a lot of Orthodox choir music was the use of, we can use the term pedal point. So the idea of one note or one sonority staying the same and elements around it changing, or the term drone, which there's a lot of overlap, but drone usually means either a one note, or again, one note, one sonority, one chord that is unchanging for a part of the piece. And what stuck with me there was, well, you can use that element in a lot of different ways, because one thing I think in the arts in general, we have this is a really useful element, because one thing staying the same and everything else being able to change gives us a sense of, gives us a place to stay, but we can go anywhere from a little bit away from there to completely contrasting. So I'll scroll down to a good example of my usage of that in this piece. Can we see this okay? Great. So the onset of the piece, I decided to create a pedal point kind of in the mid-range in the altos with the F above middle C. And on either side of this note, I subtly tried to bring in various sonorities that were very, very close on either side, but that kind of, you could say, kind of rotated around, creating a subtle sense of tonality, but also kind of veering away from that. I mean, I can demonstrate a little bit of this, where the second sonority to come in is a little bit above there on the G above. And then conversely on the other side, where we have the D flat, E flat. And what's wonderful about a choir is that, unlike the piano where we hit a note and it dies off, a choir can sustain, especially when there's multiple voices on one line, that note can be sustained for a very long time at any dynamic. So I use that to my advantage, and I use that sustained F and toggled between various sonorities around there, creating this kind of ethereal, and as Daniel mentioned, you can kind of create a kind of a fantastical element with a very, very subtle but constantly changing spectrum around one sound. So the initial passage of this piece, basically the first three systems, the first page, all surrounds this one note. And a pedal tone can be used, I mean, it can be relatively short, it can be minutes and minutes long. And I really thought, okay, I can use this very kind of fundamental and rudimentary element and really use my imagination while not veering completely away from that. And I would say that kind of stripping music down to its absolute most basic elements, as I said before, melody, harmony, rhythm, timbre, etc. You can really do a lot with as few materials as possible, which I think is something that composers, it's kind of a perpetual challenge for us, because it's easy to load up a piece with notes and rhythms and all sorts of stuff, but when you really make the most of a very small element, I think that's really it's a challenge, but it's also where we can use our imagination to its extreme. Because I mean, there are lots of pieces out there that use again lots of stuff loaded up, but I think when we go down to that minimal element and draw as much from that as possible, that's where we can use our imagination. So I mean, I'll put the link to this piece in the chat on the Zoom link, but there are multiple pedal points to listen for in this piece, all the way from this one single note F down to here, and on the top of page 2, when I have this relatively dense sonority, I'll roll the chord, I can't play it all at once, is, and the following chord. And from that I draw a 4-note pedal point, which is here, that I'm circling right here. And then again, with a denser pedal point, it's still a pedal point, I do the same sort of thing where I rotate in kind of a spectrum around that point. So I think I would say the fundamentals of my compositional process would be going from the smallest and most simple and clear elements, and drawing as much as I can from that, or from kind of secondarily from what I can draw from that, and then again from that, so that what you end up with is the material being related at its core, but also various degrees of separation that make a piece interesting, and can draw material in many directions and in many dimensions. So I'd say that's my take on the compositional process.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. All right, Daniel, let's hear your take on the compositional process in general, as well as the story of your composition of a particular piece.
Sure. So, yeah, I'll do the general overview, and then I'll talk about the Planet's Odyssey Piano Concerto, which Canton's premiering hopefully in June 2021. So I tend to like to start with some kind of image or narrative in mind. As I mentioned before, I'm interested in fantasy, I'm interested in stories. And for me, music is fundamentally narrative in structure. So in general, for some compositions, I imagine landscapes, or I use art as a source of inspiration. I've written pieces based on specific landscapes, or on artistic works, meaning from the visual arts. Or I think of specific narratives. I've written music for voice, and of course there's poetry there, so you have the narrative there. And so there is, or with, concertos, again, I think of narrative structures. So for me, it's imagining the story first, and imagining some kind of concept of the musical piece, and then sort of outlining the form of the piece. I always have a plan going into it, but then I let the piece evolve. I don't just control it to the plan exclusively. I usually have some kind of outline. It's kind of like, outlining an essay or whatever, but I have some outline of where do I want the music to go. And then I do set to work in writing. I compose in layers. So, I compose with melody or motive or whatever from the beginning, and then I build upon that. My music is very motivically derived and melodically derived. So I create things, from those smaller elements, and then I build upon that, adding harmonies, and then gradually developing it into the large-scale form. I always check into the form as I go, though. I always like to have the plan in place so I can make sure that I don't lose the forest for the trees. So that's sort of the general overview of how I approach it. Now, specifically, with the Planet's Odyssey Concerto, the idea for this concerto came about because I had known the soloist, Jeffrey Beagle, the pianist, for a while, and he was introduced to me by a mutual conductor friend of ours a number of years ago now, and we had talked about how, I'd love to write a concerto for him because he's such an amazing performer, particularly of contemporary piano concerti. And we had both discussed one great idea would be to write a concerto that could be programmed relatively easily with music that has some kind of space theme. these kinds of programs are quite common, and there's a lot of sort of celestial music out there, whether it's Holst's Planets, which of course is a very obvious pairing, or it could be Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, or it could be Beethoven's Ninth, which has a sort of celestial ending. There are less obvious pairings that could also be possible. So I start with a programmatic concept, you know, an idea or a narrative, and this Planets Odyssey sort of was born out of that. And then we had talked about how, well, okay, obviously everyone's going to be thinking of, not everyone, but a lot of people would be thinking of the Holst. How do I then create something that's actually different from that? And we talked about, you know, we were talking about it as a concept, and the idea of a theme and variations came up, so that you have, like, you know, the pianist is sort of in the role of a wanderer throughout our solar system, wandering from planet to planet. And sort of, you know, that you have this wanderer theme, and then each planet this wanderer visits, then the theme is transformed into the qualities of that planet. But rather than the mythological qualities that Holst used, you know, with Mercury being the winged messenger, or Mars the bringer of war, or whatever, I'm basing this on modern scientific knowledge of what these planets are actually really like. So for me, Mercury is very much a planet of extremes, extreme hot and cold, because, you know, by day it's hot and close to the sun, but at night it's cold and there's no atmosphere. So you have the sun against a starry night sky. What an image to be able to put into music. I mean, oh my God. I mean, the ideas just exploded from that imagery. And then with Venus, there's the possibility of maybe life floating in its upper atmosphere. Of course, Venus itself is totally uninhabitable as far as we know, you know, if it's 900 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface, but in the upper reaches of the atmosphere, you could have biological molecules, scientists think, up in the air. So again, what wonderful inspiration, life in the air. So I set out to create these images through music. And so I keep going through, and I don't want to, you know, go on and on about it, but for me, for example, Saturn, we know pretty well now that it has diamond rain on it because of the intense amount of pressure on carbon. Farther down, it rains diamonds. And again, another wonderful image. So I start with these images in mind, and then also do the share screen thing just a little bit. I'm not going to take too long with it, but let me see if I can do that now. Is it letting me? Looks like I am, right? Great. So I started with the theme, and here is the theme of this piano concerto. And there's the pianist playing it on his own. And I don't know if the playback will work on this, but I'll give it let's give it a chance, just because I don't have a piano here.
It's probably not going to be great, but we can try.
Okay, well, I'll give it a try. If it doesn't work, then whatever. Just to give you an idea of what it sounds like. Does that work? I don't know. Okay, so anyway, there's the music, and then what do? You have a theme and variation. So you have an idea, you have a motive, you have a melody, here's the motive, here's the melody, and then later on in the piece, and I'll just show you how you can see it visually, how it has transformed, for example, into Mercury. There's this flourishy stuff. I gave you the image of this violent sort of visual image. You have the sun, and then you have the stars against the sun. And so we have the sparkly stars, which you can see with the fast notes there. And then the theme, da 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 da, comes back, but it's in a very changed form as opposed to how it had been in the piano. So it goes throughout all this, and I think that's probably enough so you just get an idea of how I work, but I start with image, and then I try to convey the image in terms of these musical gestures, and then develop it from there.
Awesome, spectacular. And I hope that everybody who is listening tonight who is in the Northeast Ohio area will come in June of next year to hear the world premiere of this piece. Finally, let's hear about the compositional process from Zach Gulabov Davis.
All right, thank you. I think both of my colleagues have pretty much explained all there is to be explained, but I will do my best to contribute to this. So for me personally, obviously length, instrumentation, all that kind of stuff is the first parameter I take into consideration. Every piece I'm doing these days comes as some form of request. So it's not like I get to pick and decide to do a piece for 10 tubas or something. A lot of times the parameters are already preset, whether that be, string quartet or solo piano or some other combination. That's something that sort of goes with the territory of composition. If, someone asks you to write a piece and you want to do it, you go with that instrumentation. So after that parameter is sort of dispensed with, I pretty much begin my process with just an initial kernel of an idea. This could be, say, a melodic fragment that I like, a rhythm, a specific harmony. My cell phone right here is a very good friend of mine because a lot of times I will be in a practice room or by a piano, maybe improvising, trying something out, sort of with a future composition in mind. And I'll often record myself, whether it be a melody I like, a rhythm, any of those things I discussed. Sometimes those ideas make their way into pieces. Other times they're just sort of stray voice memos that end up getting deleted at some point down the road. But ultimately, yeah, most of my pieces just begin with some really, really small idea, not even a fully fleshed out melody or harmony or whatever. And after I have that, after I have something that I think, okay, this is something I can work with, maybe it's not perfect, but I know I can tweak it, make it into a nice melody, make it into a nice accompanimental figure, some kind of harmony, whatever. Once I have something that I think is sort of viable on a larger scale, I really start going back to the initial stuff I was talking about, like the parameters of the piece. How long does it need to be, or how long do I personally want it if I have more flexibility? And then I sort of start thinking about the formal structure of the piece. For me, form is exceedingly important because you can have an excellent starting point, an excellent, initial kernel, but if it doesn't sort of have a cohesive formal narrative, it's really easy for it to fall apart. So once I'm past those formative stages, probably the most exciting part of the whole process is sketching out the overall trajectory of a piece. So I'll open my composing software program, very similar to the one we just saw a couple minutes ago, and sketch out a few ideas. So say if I started with that aforementioned melody or rhythm or whatever I had, I'll put that somewhere at the beginning. And then I'll say, okay, say the piece needs to be, 7 minutes long, somewhere around there. I'll say, I want a climax towards the last, third of the piece, for example. And then I want it to do X at the end, maybe come to a jubilant finale or something like that. And I'll sketch out some of those things. And I'll say, oh, maybe somewhere towards the middle of the piece, I want a contrasting section, maybe something slow and lyrical or whatever. So I'll just drop a few ideas here and there for each of those things. And then I'll just start working on them. I might start working on the climactic arrival point of the piece. And if I like what goes down there, I'll go back and keep expanding that initial idea that sparked the impetus for this piece. And I'll just keep filling in and filling in. Some things will work, some things won't work. And eventually, all those empty bars will just sort of start decreasing, and pretty soon we'll have a completed piece. And I've applied this process. The caveat is I'm obviously still learning. Every piece I write, I feel like it's a totally new experience, and that's sort of the beauty of composition. But I've applied this process in some variation to pretty much every piece I've done. So whether the piece is through composed, i.e. it starts with something and then it just sort of goes with that idea, or maybe has some sort of cyclical form, starts with something, goes somewhere else, and then eventually returns back to something with a semblance of the opening. I've really relied on this method, and it's yielded results that I like. So in light of that, I wanted to just pull up a short piece I had. Again, I'm not by a piano, so I won't be able to realize it, but I will link a recording in the chat as well. But I'm going to pull up a short piece I wrote for solo piano. I think it's only like 4 or 5 pages. And I just sort of want to talk about how basically I use 2 measures to write the whole piece. Let me see if I can pull this up real quick. Share screen. We good? Perfect. All right, so this piece is called Resound. It's just a not even 2-minute etude for solo piano. And if we look here on the second 2 measures of the work, I just came up with this little idea in 7/8. Dun, 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 dun. Very repetitive, maybe slightly catchy, whatever you want to call it. I came up with that idea, I think, sitting at the piano. And I thought, okay, this is something I can work with. Being an etude, I just wanted to have one idea and just go with it for the entire piece, sort of in the character of the genre. And so I took that idea and basically just tried to present it in multiple iterations that didn't all sound the same. So I wanted this kind of gradual build of momentum. Notice we start at piano. This first iteration is nice and soft. The piece kind of goes along for a while, and then guess what? It gets repeated again and again and again. If we look down here, this looks very similar. Right here, measure, what is it, 21? 24. Very similar to our initial iteration, but a little more substantial. It's mezzo forte, there's more notes in the left hand. And we'll see the same thing if we move on. If we look over here, measure 34, we've moved to a different key, a different tonal center. So I'm adding a different color there, but the pattern still stays. Now we're forte, we're growing and we're growing and we're growing. We get to the next page, measure 60, over here right in the middle of that page 4. Exact same pattern, dun, 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 dun. But now we're at double forte. Everyone's an octave, so the pianist is sort of getting taxed to their virtuosic limits. And then from there on out, it's just reiterations of that gesture or slight variations on it until the piece comes to a really, really, really loud close. So that was sort of a, concise approach to my idea of form, where I knew I wanted to start in this soft place. I had my idea. I knew where I wanted to go. I didn't compose it in a linear fashion at all. I actually, if we look at this page right here, I probably composed the last, half of this page first. I had my initial idea, then I composed that. I knew where I wanted to get to, and then I just started filling it in. And again, that's a process that works just as well for a larger scale piece. I'm going to drop the recording for this in the comments. The pianist I work with was absolutely fantastic, so you should definitely check out her work as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Zach. Now, next question. We are, of course, the Canton Symphony Orchestra, and I know that all 3 of you have written at least a few pieces for the orchestra. So next, talk about the unique challenges that come with composing specifically for this ensemble, for the full orchestra. We'll start with Daniel.
So as much as the computer may be able to create, a synthetic sound of orchestration that, my students are in love with or whatever, or you know, people are like, oh, that's amazing. It really doesn't substitute for what a wonderful real orchestral sound is actually like. So much has to be done using imagination. For example, I can't stand computer generated percussion sounds, or you know, and a lot of MIDI. I have pretty advanced MIDI that's actually done through artificial intelligence. It's really pretty amazing, but still, it's nothing like you're really going to hear with a real live orchestra. And so, so much of writing for orchestra is being able to imagine what do those choruses of instruments sound like when they're together, getting balance right as much as you can in your imagination, using different timbres and colors. All of the instruments in the orchestra have such a wide palette of colors. It's just amazing. I mean, the possibilities of different tone colors are so, I mean, almost limitless. And so when I'm writing, I'm constantly thinking about how do I convey my musical ideas in as creative a way as possible that exploits all of the tone colors of the orchestra. So what does that mean? Well, English horns, for example, are wonderful instruments that are usually featured in orchestral music and not always featured in chamber music. And they're wonderful solo instruments. So I was thrilled to be able to have an English horn for the Canton piece and for the Planet's Odyssey. And of course, if you have an English horn in the orchestra, you're gonna give it a solo. I mean, what's the point of having an English horn in a tutti? I mean, that's just stupid. Or, you know, we have all these, you know, there are four horns there, and there's a horn moment, a really big moment, where the horns get to have their bells in the air. And it's really fun to watch, too. But, of course, that was championed by Mahler. But it also creates a different acoustical phenomenon. When the bells are in the air, the sound is even that much bigger. There's these wonderful things that you can do with timbre in the orchestra. Of course, texture is another element. I love creating complex textures with the orchestra using different figuration, where you have a lot of fluttery notes, arpeggiation, and you know, that kind of stuff. Really fast textural notes where you have the strings creating a wonderful sort of sound mass just themselves. Sibelius used that extensively in his music, and then Rautavaara, our Finnish composer who died recently, he used it extensively. Of course, Ligeti in his atmospheres. So I think about these kinds of wonderful sound masses and textures that I can create, and of course with the planets, you have the gas giants, you know, Jupiter and Saturn. So to create these sort of turbulent atmospheres, using sound masses and textures, you know, it's just really exciting. I want to create windy or stormy music, and they're great for winds and storms. I mean, Neptune, the winds go up to 1,200 miles an hour, or 1,300 or something. And so the woodwinds and the strings are incredible for creating those kinds of swirling textures. However, if I'd given that music to a brass player, they'd be like, "Oh, you idiot, you can't do it that way." So you have to be cognizant, of course, of what can the instruments do effectively, and of course, how to convey your musical ideas within the parameters of what can people realistically do, also on limited rehearsal time too, because, you know, with an orchestra, you don't have 85 hours of rehearsal time to prepare this together. So it has to be put together quickly and cleanly and clearly, and the music has to be playable basically immediately. And so to that end, my wife's a violinist, and I constantly take the music to her and I say, okay, is that too difficult to pull off in an orchestral setting in limited rehearsal time? Or how should we change it? Or I even take a violin and I finger some of the arpeggiation or whatever to see, oh, how painful is that to play? Or is it easy? Can I move it around? All these things there are to think about to make sure that what you come up with is something where the orchestra members and the conductor aren't going to shoot you for creating something that just isn't practical. So with orchestra, it has to be practical, but it also has to be creative and make use of the colors you have. So I think that's how I'd summarize it.
Awesome. Zach, how about you, writing for orchestra?
Writing for orchestra, there's just so much to contend with. Compared to, say, the solo piano piece I was just talking about, you know, where you literally have 2 staves, all of a sudden you're just going to be presented with this massive score. And it can be quite daunting, especially if you're putting together a score on a computer program or, you know, just by hand or whatever, just looking at all those empty staves that, you know, have to be filled. So yeah, thank you for those amazing points. It's, yeah, all about orchestration, all that kind of stuff. Again, it's a little overwhelming, but it's also really, really fun. I found one of the best ways to sort of get inspiration goes back to the concepts I was talking about in the introduction, where I was talking about sort of inspiration, whether it was me playing in youth orchestra or playing solo works or whatever. But studying the scores of masters is by far the best way, the most sort of informative experience I've ever gotten in terms of orchestral writing. I'm really fascinated by the way the orchestra can function as this just sort of grand vessel of expression all the way down to a, you know, sort of chamber setting. If you look at like the works of a composer like Gustav Mahler, he's amazing at creating these just massive walls of sound, all of a sudden going down into, you know, chamber-like settings with just a few instruments playing. And having that range of color and expressive possibility is just exciting, and it's amazing. There's nothing quite like it. All that being said, you know, the daunting aspect of it definitely weighs heavily upon, I'd say, any composer's mind. And going back to my discussions of form or whatever, it's easy to get bogged down in the details and saying, what instrument am I going to designate here or do this or that? And sort of forgetting about the form or where you want to go or anything. I know if I start writing a piece just on the full score, just like that, without any sort of pre-compositional process, I'd be lost. I'd be totally lost. So I love, you know, sketching something out beforehand, whether it be some kind of piano reduction or maybe something in like 4 staves, just to kind of get an idea for what I want. You know, I want the woodwinds to generally be doing this. I want the brass to generally be doing this. And then I can sort of assign specific instruments to specific parts later on. But for me, just, you know, having that many instruments at my disposal, whether it be for orchestra or band or something, I need to sort of set up a few parameters above that just so I don't get totally lost. But again, whenever I have questions about the process for writing for orchestra or any large ensemble, I just go straight back to all those composers that I know and love and see how they approached the medium. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. Finally, Michael, writing for orchestra.
Yeah, so 2 thoughts on this topic. The first goes off of exactly what Zach said. When you look at the orchestral music of the masters, one really fascinating thing is if you were to look at, you know, 10, 15, 20 good orchestral scores, you could even, like, I don't have good vision. If I were to take off my glasses and look at those scores, the individual notes aside, you really start to notice the different proportions of like a really huge dense 2D versus a really kind of thin texture, and how these different textures are always used to their own advantage. You don't want an orchestral score that's too thin, that's too kind of chamber music-y, but you also don't want just every instrument playing the entire time, because that's also not using the orchestra to its full advantage. And I think part of I think one of the most integral challenges of writing orchestral music is finding that balance between the thin and the delicate and the subtle, and versus using the orchestra to its maximum. Because I mean, if you're only using one instrument at a time, that's not using the orchestra. So it's finding that, again, it's always finding a balance, right? And I think my second thought on that is the kind of wonderful challenge of writing orchestral music. Let's say you're writing a solo flute piece, or a piece for any instrument that can more or less play one note at a time. We have multiphonics on the flute, but that aside, there's infinite possibilities there, right? We're writing for, it's one instrument, one note at a time, it's infinite. Then you combine that with the fact that the orchestra has, it's like the infinity of infinities, if that idea makes sense, where every instrument can do infinite things, and then you put everything together, and it's like, where do I go with this plethora of possibilities? And then the question is, where do I set my limitations? And I think that's kind of the crux of writing orchestral music, is setting some form of a limitation and multiple limitations, and only then can you kind of go along with your piece. Because of course you can do so many different things, which is inspiring but also kind of terrifying, because it's a question of where do I go with my unbelievable amount of possibilities. So I think like as Daniel and Zach both said, it's fun, it's interesting, it's inspiring, it's very kind of as a composer, it kind of gives you that real almost like a giddy sense of I can do anything I want, but also where do I kind of give myself channels that send me in a sense of direction. And I think that's kind of the big challenge, but also the exact same thing that makes orchestral music so that draws composers to write for orchestra, which is a really wonderful thing.
Awesome, fantastic. Now, each of you showed an example of a score that you had written, and it was a score that you produced using some kind of computer-based music notation software. And I was wondering if one of you could volunteer to share your screen and just tell everybody a little bit about how a music notation software works. Zach, go ahead.
Alrighty, I actually have something queued up and ready to go. I just finished working on another piece that involves perpetual unrelenting momentum. It's all complete, but I can sort of mess around with it a little to give you all a bit of information on it. Let me share my screen real quick. All right, are we good? Perfect. So the program you saw a few minutes ago was Sibelius. I am running its sort of competitor, whatever you want to call it, Finale. It's sort of like Mac and PC. I actually don't have strong feelings about either. This is literally the same program my composition professor, who I started working with my 4th year in undergrad, suggested. And I still just have the same program and re-download it every time I get a new laptop. But these programs are really powerful. They allow you to do so many different things, aside from just entering notes. So see, I have these different options up here, all these notes I can enter, different sort of functions to input over here. I can literally just click a note, put it there, decide how long I want to make it, put a rest, all this kind of stuff. Composers get pretty fast at all this, you know, as time goes by. But in addition to this just being a word processing software, it also allows you to hear the piece realized in real time. It's a very rudimentary rendition of the piece. You, as we were talking about in the sort of orchestral sense, you can't get a sense of the, you know, orchestrational scope of the piece. All the instruments sometimes play at the wrong volume or all these different things. But it does give you a sense of pacing, whether or not a section is too long, whether or not your theme goes on long enough or, you know, develops enough or whatever. So one can just literally push the play button and the piece will start playing back. And yeah, I notate the whole thing, like a whole piece in Finale. There's tons of different things, like I add dynamics here. You can move them around, get them just where you want them. It allows you to have a, great deal of flexibility in terms of formatting your piece, making sure it's exceedingly readable. Also, like we were talking about in the orchestral sense, you want to give someone music that's basically sight readable, the first time they see it, or at least something that they can, replicate in a pretty efficient manner. So having these tools are amazing. You can also go here and create parts. Go and create a violin part, create a piano part if the pianist wanted it, all that kind of stuff. But it's a very, very powerful tool, and I'd love to hear the other two composers chime in if they have any thoughts. But yeah.
I will say from my perspective, Zach, you may not have an opinion, but I had a teacher once tell me that Finale was the industry standard in music notation software, and I've believed that ever since I heard it. I've been a Finale user since 2002. So
I forgot about that before I spoke.
many people swear by Sibelius as well, and I respect that.
There's
Daniel,
also a new program called Dorico, which seems to be popular now. Yeah.
There is, and I have to say, I used Finale 98. I mean, and even 95, which, I guess that dates me, and then I switched to Sibelius. So, there's all sorts of, we'll have spirited debates about these different programs and why they like one better. I teach both of them, I think, and Dorico has some amazing features to it too. So I think it really has to do with people's personality and what they want, how well it works for them, and that kind of stuff. So.
Awesome. Well, guys, believe it or not, we are very nearly out of time. This we all could have gathered for a couple of drinks together and probably talked for 3 times as long. But if you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with everyone in the remaining minute that we have, or audience as well, if you have any lingering questions that you would like to ask any of our composers, please feel free.
I'll just be very fast. I love the way seems to be a resurgence of focus on new music in orchestras more recently in the past 10 years. Even I've seen much more so than it had been in decades before. And I think that's wonderful for all composers out there. And, there is not all the great music has been written before 1910. Even great music before 1910, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being a part of this. And definitely, I think that new music, that, it has, people always assume it's this clashing of metal in your ears and it hurts. But I think that it's really wonderful to hear what, modern composers are doing and how wonderful this music is and how we should support it. I know everyone in this chat is saying how much they loved it and they're all impressed by you. So thank you all so much for being a part of this session. And if there's any final words, feel free to say it. If you guys are done, then I'll go ahead and end the recording.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.